everybody, and welcome to Views on View. I'm Ari Clark, and apparently Ben thinks I'm an awesome UI UX engineer at Liquid. And today on our panel, we have Chris Fritz of the Vue core team, Docs Extraordinaire.
Hello.
And Elizabeth Fine, Vue developer and CSS enthusiast.
Hello.
And of course, Ben Hong, senior front-end engineer who also loves CSS.
Hello.
And today our guest is Luca Mezzalira. Luca, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Luca. I'm Italian. I live in London in the past 6 years. I'm a vice president of architecture in a company called DAZN. DAZN is a live streaming platform for sport. We have currently our platform available in several countries with millions of users that are watching our content every day. I'm a Google developer expert on web technologies, and I'm the London JavaScript community manager.
That's a lot.
It is indeed.
One of the things that I find that we talk a lot about at the different conferences and the different things that I'm working on is open source software. And a lot of people have a lot of ideas around open source software, but we don't often think about the people who are building it and trying to maintain it. I had a friend, John, who came to me. He's been a guest on JavaScript Jabber a couple of times. He came and he actually said, "Hey, Chuck, I wish there was a show about sustaining open source." That really hit me where I live. And I have a few other friends who are working on projects related to this. So we all got together and we put together a show called Sustain Our Software. You can find it at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com. It's a place where several people who are passionate about open source come together and have conversations about how it can be sustained and how it can be maintained and what we can do to help these maintainers continue to deliver us value that we build our software on. Most of the software we're building is based on open source, and so it's important to us to have that maintained and have it taken care of. Come check it out. It's been really interesting to listen to the conversations that they're having from people who are working in it all the time and just hear what they have to say about it. Once again, that's at sustainoursoftwarepodcast.com.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about how you ended up in web development, your experience with various JavaScript frameworks, and how you ended up working with Vue?
Okay, so I started my career roughly 16 years ago. At the beginning, I didn't do any particular study. I'm a self-taught, and basically, I was working in a factory. A friend of mine told me about HTML, HTML4 at the time. And he basically gave me a book, and I started to read it. And it was probably the first book that I read end to end, from the first page to the last page. And I was super intrigued about coding. And then suddenly I discovered ActionScript. And I became basically a Flash developer for a while. I'm a big passion about communities, and therefore the community brought me to travel a lot, to learn a lot, and talk with different people. And I became more and more passionate about coding. So far, I did I work with a lot of languages like ActionScript, Hex, Lua, Node.js, JavaScript. I wrote also a bit of Rust and Python. And I was always interesting because every time there was a new challenge, I had the opportunity to not work only on web, but a lot of, let's say, embedded systems like set-top boxes, a motorbike once, and let me think, several touch screens. And I traveled the world basically doing my job. And it was absolutely awesome so far, the experience. And the last 4 or 5 years, I moved to the architecture role, where at the beginning I was working as front-end architect, half coding, half, let's say, designing applications. And slowly but steady, I was promoted a couple of times. Now I'm vice president of architecture, so I'm overseeing front-end, backend on the cloud. I'm working a lot with Lambdas. I'm working a lot with AWS cloud provider. And it's absolutely an amazing journey because obviously at the beginning as front-end developer, you know more or less how the backend works. But now it's becoming, let's say, more predominant my time spent on the front end as well, on the back end as well on the front end. And the nice thing is that the zone has a lot of challenges for front end developers because we are working not only on web application but also on smart TVs, set-top boxes, console, and so on. So our application is basically everywhere, and that is one of the nicest challenges that I had in my career so far.
That's a lot. I suddenly feel very inexperienced. Speaking of me being inexperienced and you being very experienced, I understand that you are essentially the leader on thoughts on micro-frontends. Do you want to talk a little bit about what is a micro front end?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Leader, I think is a bit too much. I mean, I love sharing my experiences with the community, and that's why I'm here, mainly for sharing thought and also learning from others, because I think is the key things. So what is a micro-frontend? Basically, a few years ago, when I was redesigning DAZN, or how we call it 2.0, on all those different platforms, I had like my CTO that came to me and said, look, listen, we were like 50 people roughly inside the organization. Now we are over 3,000. So as you can imagine, it was a massive growing for years. And he told me, listen, Luca, you should think when you design the new application and the new architecture on something that is really scalable, where we have distributed teams that are contributing on our code base. And, I was the second person who was hired on the tech department. So I was very laughable at that time because, as you can imagine, thinking on designing something that it has to be that big, it was very complicated at the beginning. But obviously, I listened to him. I was encouraged by him. That definitely is a very experienced person. So I thought, okay, so what can I do in order to enable people to work on the same project or with people that could be in different time zones and different locations and have to work on the same project? And it's very difficult if you think about that, because I had experience in the past that also when you have like 14 developers working on the same code base, very often that we have like backstops because of people weren't agreeing on a specific direction. They want to change something, so they want to refactor stuff. Now we're talking about hundreds of developers working on the same project. And suddenly, you had to come up with something that could make the deal, basically. I started to figure out, based on my experience, what other architectures, also outside the front-end world, were allowing us to achieve that. And obviously, the first thought was, let's think about microservices.
Could you quickly tell us what microservices are? Because I know until recently, I'd heard the term, but I didn't actually know what it was. So I imagine there's a few listeners who feel the same way. So could you explain microservices?
Absolutely. So a microservice is a self-contained and autonomous and independent a service that could be deployed inside a system and is responding to an API that you can consume and is doing just one job and one job only. It's not taking care about the whole system. And when you have a backend system that has multiple microservices, you can move away from your old monolith that contains all your APIs. And therefore, if you need to scale, you need to scale all your APIs. But suddenly you discover that at the end, not all the APIs needs to be scaled. And that's one of the key advantage of the independency of microservices. So if you think about what microservice is and how could be applicable to the front end, we suddenly discover that on a micro-frontend, you can apply similar concept. You can have an independent release of a service, in this case, a micro-frontend. You can have, let's say, a technology-agnostic piece of software. Therefore, picking your favorite framework could be Vue, could be React, it could be Angular, wherever the company is heading to. Then you can deliver autonomously. It can be, let's say, sliced and divided based on a business domain. And when I say business domain, think about, for instance, Netflix. In Netflix, for instance, we have a key business domain, a core business domain, I was calling domain-driven design, that is playback and the catalog. This is like the core domain and why Netflix exists. Obviously, Netflix for existing and for subscribing needs a lot of other APIs, a lot of other views. That is, for instance, the subscription, the payment view, and the help, and the customer support, and the chat, and so on. But those are not core domains. They're just part of the domain. And if you start to think how you can, how nice could you can slice an application, create independent teams that are taking local decision inside their domain, picking the right database for the right job and the right programming language for the right job instead of sharing and having a trade-off across the entire system, then you can start to think, oh, maybe I can do the same on the front end. And that's where basically micro-frontends are coming from me. Obviously, there are a lot of people that are trying to start from the technology point of view, saying, okay, micro-frontend is an iframe that contains something, or I don't know, is what they call edge side includes that you can run in, let's say, a markup language that you have available on the CDN level. And you can substitute element like components if you think about in React or Vue or wherever it is. So you have a different way that you can express micro-frontends. But in reality, we need to think about the principles behind them in order to embrace them properly.
Yeah. Okay, so that seemed like a very thorough explanation of what a micro front end is. So it sounds like, generally speaking, micro front ends pair best with microservices backend. Would you say that's accurate?
It is, to a certain extent. Obviously, you can have one or the other, or you can have both. It's completely up to you. There is one powerful thing that we discovered during our journey, because at the beginning, what we had was a monolith on the back end and a monolith or a single page application on the front end. And what happened at that stage is that obviously every time that we change something, we need to release a lot amount of code, maybe also for a tiny change. And that could potentially break another part of the system that we didn't take in consideration. And it was very frustrating, obviously. So what we thought is, okay, we analyzed our platform. We said, okay, so we have like certain APIs that needs to scale. And that is the same applicable to the front end, because those API needs to scale, but also needs to change frequently. So if we have a way to de-risk this deployment, we can have like a better solution in order to, let's say, deploy our platform. And that's where we started to migrate from a monolith to microservices. And when you combine microservices with micro-frontends, if you think about that, one thing that I really envy in a small organization or startup is the fact that there is a team that is doing front-end and back-end, and they're taking all the decision locally. They don't have to ask to the CTO or they ask to someone. They just take a decision, they move very fast. And it's usually where a large organization are losing the ground compared to startups, because they don't have that agility, they are not moving that fast. So if you imagine that you can take a large organization, slicing by tiny domains, like, I don't know, the subscription, the payment team, and something else, and you slice a domain end-to-end, where a team, cross-functional team, can do front-end and back-end, taking local decisions and deploy independently from the rest of the company. It's absolutely amazing what you can achieve. Obviously, that is, let's say, in a grand scheme of things, nice to say, but obviously there are other complications, like there are some APIs that needs to work together, there are some piece of UI that have to work together, and so on. So then you introduce, let's say, a level of complexity that is leading us to API contracts. So how much we want to spend on identifying those API contracts and work towards them. And that helps a lot in order to front-end and back-end to create, let's say, a way that two teams can work in parallel against a specific contract. And then at the end of the work, let's say every iteration, every 2-week sprint, or if you work with Kanban at the end of each single end-to-end flow for a Kanban, throughput in Kanban, you have like some checkpoints that you see for your team A is working on something that makes sense for team B and vice versa. And that's, for me, something incredible, because we start to have the agility that we had on a smaller organization back to a large organization of 300 and something developers.
So I think one of the questions that probably occurs to most developers who work on sort of monolithic, SPA frameworks, as you mentioned, is that with micro-frontends, doesn't this run the risk then of having, say, because I know some companies actually have multiple frameworks running on the same page, right? The header is written in React, the shopping cart's written in Angular, and then the rest of you. What are some of your thoughts on that?
Okay, let's start with one thing. I believe that because it's possible, it doesn't mean that you need to embrace it. Let's start from
I like that.
There are a lot of things that are possible, but are not best practices.
Fair enough.
There is another thing, and I think is very important, that comes back to the principle where I started my journey. So one of the principle of microservices and micro-frontends is the fact that you need to identify your business model. So the part, how small is a micro-frontend? From my point of view, I think having multiple frameworks and having multiple micro-frontends in the same view is becoming very challenging to maintain, in particularly with large teams. The path that we took in DAZN is slicing by domain, creating basically all single pages, end-to-end, managed by one framework and one team. That is the case of the landing page for us. So we have a team that creates a builder to create basically landing pages that are just a single page, or single page application, but very tiny, very narrowed, if you want, that are following business domain more than technical constraints. And what I mean for that is I analyzed at the beginning how our users were interacting in our platform. So looking that we had like 100% of users were going to the landing page. And then from there to the sign in or sign up journey, there was, 50% of drop, just making up some numbers. And then from completing the sign up journey to the authenticated page, we have like 15% or 20%. So you see immediately that you can identify some areas where it doesn't make any sense having a single page application for loading a landing page when honestly just 50% of your traffic is benefit from downloading all that chunk of code. So slicing up by looking at numbers, looking at data, allowed us to create, let's say, different journey for our users that are pretty smooth and loading only the code that is needed for that specific journey. There is another advantage for us because, as I said at the beginning, we are working with low-end devices like set-top boxes, for instance, or old console like PlayStation 3. And those devices, they are not very powerful. And therefore, memory-wise, every byte counts. So in that case, loading only the code that is needed allowed us to enhance the experience of our interface because we can add more, let's say, animations or adding more functionalities that before we weren't able because the footprint of our application was larger than before. And vast majority of that wasn't used.
Luca, do you think that having micro-frontends allows you to create autonomous teams that can develop more expertise in certain areas in a way that's beneficial to the overall development community at your company? Or do you find that having people so specialized can affect your operational readiness? For example, if something goes wrong within another micro front end, because you have people so specialized, is it difficult to, find resources, say if people are out or not available to fix a bug or an on-call incident?
Okay, that's a good question. So as I said, we have a live platform. So all our teams are owning what they are writing, in more or less like Netflix model. So what it means for us is that they're also on call. So we have a rota where people are on call for each single team. We have usually 2 engineers that they are responsible for their vertical. I think the main challenge we found working this way is that is knowledge sharing. So in order to do that, we started to have a couple of events that are happening bi-weekly or every month. This depends from the meeting. Sometimes it's a tech guild between only a specific area of the business that could be only backend or only frontend. Sometimes it's what we call the town hall, where in each single dev center, we have currently 4 dev center. We monthly have like 1 hour and a half, 2 hours, where any engineer from any dev center can come and share what they have achieved, what was the problem, and so on. So we found, let's say, interesting. Obviously, locally is easy. In the same dev center, there are people that are catching up regularly. But when you have, let's say, people distributed in Europe, like we have, having those moments is helping a lot. And then as architects and as well as engineers, we are traveling a lot in different dev centers for workshops and face-to-face meeting because the communication has to flow. Despite you are providing something that to move faster, it doesn't mean that is always right. So you need to share the information because otherwise a lot of people feel isolated and is not what we want to achieve. Here we want to achieve agility and speed of delivery, but we don't want to crash completely a community of developers inside the organization because it's not what we are aiming for.
That makes a lot of sense.
This is purely out of curiosity. Do developers ever or sometimes change teams within DAZN, or do people tend to just stick with their one team forever and ever?
I think what we put in place is interesting. At least if I was a developer at this time, I would love it. So we have like some roles that are temporary. So we have a developer experience team where we have part of the team that is fixed. So they're working on this, and other part, like 40%, that is in rota. So there are people from other teams that are joining, maybe for developing a specific tool for the developer experience, and then they go back to their team. We have also, let's say, developers that after a while, they would like to see another challenge, and we encourage them to change the team. So we are more than happy. Obviously, we cannot do every month because otherwise the velocity could suffer. But in reality, we have several developers that moved from one team to another one because maybe they wanted to see a completely different challenge. And that's for me really cool, because obviously I work in other organizations and it wasn't always possible because the expertise that the person is bringing with him. But in reality, for the zone, I think because we are trying to spend a lot of time doing knowledge sharing, it becomes easier. It's not always, let's say, possible, but it's often possible. We saw there, let's say, some plus on doing that and some drawbacks. The plus is obviously people stick around more for longer. London is a very competitive market for developers. It's estimated that you have like developers stick in a company for a year and a half, maximum 2 years. We have developers that are over 3 years that are in the company. And that is great because it means that the culture and the environment is working. There are other drawbacks because obviously this is working in particular where we're in more consolidated places. In other dev centers, we have more challenges because it's maybe, for instance, in one dev center in particular, we ramp up from nothing to 150 tech people in 6 months. So as you can imagine, it's like huge. And there we try to apply the same thing, but it's not stable enough because every week we have 10 new joiners. And it's spreading this thing is just complicated. It's not trivial at all. So I hope that we destabilize this dev center very soon, maybe next year, where the hiring would be, let's say, less aggressive. But overall, I think so far I think it's pretty enjoyable the place where we create.
So do you split up your other resources in a similar way? By other resources, I mean people other than developers, like QA analysts, for example, or project managers?
Yeah. So basically, if you think about one of the key laws that are ruling or let's say, driving the consideration of architecture, usually you think about the Conways Law. The Conways Law states the fact that usually you design an architecture based on how the organization is organized. And that for me was an issue because obviously if you want to be cutting edge, you need to push forward. So usually what we have is currently creating an end-to-end, let's say, team that is composed not only by front-end and back-end developers where possible. Sometimes we have teams that are just front-end or just back-end because it depends from domain that they're working on. But then we have always associated a technical project manager to one team or two teams max, one product owner. And basically, if you think about that, you have a tiny organization that is fully autonomous on that specific thing. So we try to implement what they call the reverse maneuver for the Conways Law. Instead of relying on how was the organization, we change our organization in order to follow the architecture. And that was probably the smartest thing that we have done so far, because I remember one day they came to me saying, listen, we are opening this new dev center. We need to provide them work. So how do you envision this? And we had several discussions with my peers, and suddenly I had a spark in my brain saying, okay, maybe we are doing something wrong here, because if we spread our domain, having a bit of acquisition retention in London, a bit in Amsterdam, and a bit somewhere else, that could create friction between teams. Instead, if we try to identify what are our key domains and we assign each one domain per dev center, then we become very frictionless because each team has his own peer basically next to them. And the worst case scenario is like 2 minutes by walk to the next desk instead of waiting for a call or coming to London or stuff like that. And that I think was pretty nice. Then the next challenge was how we can reduce the communication problems or increase, the communication between dev centers. And that's why we started to have different meetings across the organization.
What are some other tools, if any, that you employed to create a culture that was conducive to this sort of new type of organizational structure?
When you say tool,
like the meetings, like very broadly tools.
Okay.
Mechanisms, whatever.
I think what, in my opinion, is helping us a lot is definitely working small iterations. Is creating bridges between different teams. So, for instance, another tool that worked pretty well for us is, for instance, we have some teams that are centralized. And what I mean centralized is like architecture or the cloud engineers, certain cloud engineers that are helping across the business and across the platform, because each single team is responsible for their cloud strategy. but they have to interact with architecture, obviously, and they have to interact with the SREs and the cloud engineers. Usually, what we do as a centralized team is creating like the vision and create some guardrails where the team can operate. And one thing that we found really helpful to challenge our assumptions is using RFCs, so request for comments on GitHub. And that is a nice way to manage that, because obviously the team can challenge your architecture or challenge your decision and propose something new. And there are other people that can chip in asynchronously without creating a meeting and having a moment for doing that. And that is something that it helped, in my opinion. Currently, we are about to roll out the RFC process also for architecture. And we are adding also a new functionality. There's a new process that is the architecture clinic, where people can, join a virtual meeting, where they can ask questions to an architect. So what we are trying to do, obviously, we have a limited amount of resources. We cannot have architects everywhere in the world. So therefore, we are trying to do our best for mitigating the fact that we are in London or another location. The other thing that we are doing is trying to always have a say and create a process where developers at different stage can chip in and provide us feedback. Because the reality is, when you create those teams that are specialized for a specific business domain, they can help us and they can help you as architects to design a better solution. And that for me is a big advantage, because usually I work in an organization where there was this ivory tower of architects that were deciding stuff. Now is more democratizing architecture, where people can have a say and can chip in and change it potentially, understanding the context. Because often what I've seen is developers are challenging you, but maybe sometimes they're missing the point, missing the context why a decision was made. And sometimes it was the right decision at the right moment. But obviously in 6 months' time, the business and the technical world is changing, and we need to, instead of fighting, embracing it. When we mean embracing, it means also revising certain decisions that maybe 6 months ago was pretty valid, but 6 months after are completely not.
This episode is sponsored by Sentry.io. Recently, I came across a great tool for tracking and monitoring problems in my apps. Then I asked them if they wanted to sponsor the show and allow me to share my experience with you. Sentry provides a terrific interface for keeping track of what's going on with my app. It also tracks releases so I can tell if what I deployed makes things better or worse. They give you full stack traces and as much information as possible about the situation when the error occurred to help you track down the errors. Plus, one thing I love, you can customize the context provided by Sentry. So, if you're looking for specific information about the request, you can provide it. It automatically scrubs passwords and secure information, and you can customize the scrubbing as well. Finally, it has a user feedback system built in that you can use to get information from your users. Oh, and I also love that they support open source to the point where they actually open sourced Sentry if you want to self-host it. Use the code DevChat at Sentry.io to get 2 months free on Sentry's small plan. That's code DevChat at Sentry.io.
I can see why you reduced your churn rate. It really sounds like you make it very clear that you value the contributions of every developer. And I know that for me, transparency is huge in terms of my happiness in a workplace. So, wow, yeah, that sounds like you guys are definitely taking the right approach here.
Yeah, we're trying to do our best. Again, there are challenges because it's not always possible and easy, in particular for new dev centers. But I think everyone has the mindset inside the organization to make their best and trying to reduce the friction. And obviously, it's not always working, but it's often working. And we saw that applied pretty well in London. We saw that is happening pretty well in Poland, where we have another dev center. And now we need to do the same effort and the same thing also for the other dev centers.
Very cool. To bring back the micro-frontend to the sort of the framework discussion. So obviously shared component libraries are a really big discussion, right? As far as like code reuse and trying to be dry and, don't repeat yourselves. So, what are, obviously I think in a micro-frontend architecture, it sounds like code reuse is you're just much more susceptible to this. So what are some of your thoughts on this?
Code reuse is definitely a hot topic on Micro-Frontends. I can tell you what we are doing and my experience as a developer. And then let's see if it's, let's say, the same thing that you are thinking about. My experience personally is I work a lot in, let's say, an imperative code base. I work in a functional code base. I saw the power of inheritance. I saw the drawbacks of inheritance. I saw the power of composition and the drawbacks of composition. And that's brilliant, understanding all those techniques. The code reusability, though, is important, in my opinion, but in my opinion, is not essential. I mean, recently there was a nice interview to the CTO of ThoughtWorks. She was asked by Neil Ford, that is very famous architect, what was a myth that she discovered in her career. And the first thing that she said, the myth of reusability. Because in reality is, and this is happening also in my organization, sometimes we create like shared components that are used twice. It's more difficult to adding a new functionality in one of this shared component more than writing it from scratch. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have shared components. We have some shared components in our case, like for instance, the video player that is super complex. And we have like a team of roughly 10 people that are working only on video player every single day. And that is a component that is currently used by one micro-frontend, but in the future could be used by several others. And that is one example. When there is complexity to handle, where there is a lot of business logic and there is complexity, in my opinion, does make a lot of sense. But when I don't want to, for instance, for certain components like the header and the footer, we have like 4 different implementations. And that wasn't, let's say, the main scope at the beginning, but we saw that accelerate dramatically the delivery of that. And I know that the following question is, okay, how do you create design consistency on what you're doing? Because obviously, if you re-implement 4 or 5 times a component, how can you do that? So that is a debate that we started to do in the company. And currently, I think it's not pixel perfect, but we are working currently on a new plan on introducing a design system that will allow us to be pixel perfect and have a lot of reusability on certain primitive components. And when I say primitive, is very intentional, because obviously, if you think about design system, you can have like different level of design system. You can arrive to have a library with some business logic and something very complex. In my opinion, for micro-frontends, if you want to leverage the power of that, you need to stop slightly behind that. So you need to arrive to have primitive components that will allow you to be implemented everywhere. And if you have like, let's say, a unique framework that you're using, bear in mind that you need to try to have multiple libraries of the same framework for different versions, because obviously you can have in micro-frontends that one part of the application is written in Vue and in the newer version and one in the older version. So if those are not retrocompatible, you need to create like 2 versions. And talking with other, let's say, design teams, they were saying that, for instance, migrating one design system from Angular to React or from Vue to Angular, it took like a week of work. That is not a lot if you think about that. And maintaining is not a problem. There are tons of tools out there that will allow us to speed up this process. For instance, one thing that we are looking at that was released by Amazon is the style dictionary. That is pretty nice and allows you basically to define your design token in JSON, and you describe how you want your font size, and different other things. Then they combine everything and they can output based on the configuration that you provide. It could be either ES6 code if you're using CSS in JS. It could be, CSS. It could be Sass. It could be even for mobile, Swift classes or Objective-C classes or Java code. So it's really flexible and it's thought across multiple platforms. That is a key thing. So I think we are going to introduce the style dictionary project, I hope very soon. It's based on few deadlines that we have, our deadlines that we have currently in the zone. But I would like to roll out this very soon to have that for next year. And the idea behind that is empowering the design team to do their changes, provide to the developers something that is primitive but good enough to be implemented everywhere. Technology-wise, we are looking to web components for doing that. The main challenge that we have currently, we are doing a spike for doing that on TVs, in particular on all devices, because at the end of the day, TVs are working with basically windowless browsers, but very old version, like it's working like with Opera old version for certain devices. And we need to understand if the polyfills will be able to supply the retrocompatibility we need for web components. Otherwise, we need to look more creating like a different version of different library that it won't take too much, considered our primitive elements, so that it won't be, let's say, too complex logic-wise, but it's still a different approach from the initial one that we thought about.
So it sounds like your stance as far as like the repeating yourself. I think there's a tweet that you mentioned in your article where it says duplication is far cheaper than the wrong abstraction.
Okay, so it wasn't my sentence, but I really liked that sentence. It was coming from an engineer. I was explaining that having a wrong abstraction could lead to more problems, more troubles than benefits. In my experience, I had something similar where we found a nice anti-pattern, well documented, that is called a diamond anti-pattern. Basically, we were extending a core library from we adding multiple libraries that were inheriting from this, and they were just extending functionality. And then suddenly, because we had like 7-8 teams working or using those libraries, because they weren't able to have something done in the core library, basically they start to extend that. And suddenly when we update the core library, nothing was working because the core library made some breaking changes and we need to test all the games that we were working on. It was a nightmare. And those kind of, unfortunately, are happening more often than not. And still, we are thinking, oh yeah, we need to abstract, but in reality, abstraction sometimes is just, let's say, a naive way to think about the real value that we are creating. Because at the end, I truly think we are not writing code for the sake of writing code. We are hired for writing code to create value for the business. And we need to create this value. And sometimes it's a trade-off. It's not always we need to respect everything. I know pretty well the dry concept and all the other concepts of abstraction behind that. But it doesn't mean that you need to follow blindly those rules. You need to apply those rules where are needed. And sometimes knowing that you are breaking those rules, apply something different.
I'll be honest, when I was going through some of your Medium articles yesterday, my first inclination was to be like, no, why would you do that? Why would you repeat yourself? And why would you be like encouraging that? But then as I continued to read, and it was specifically the expensive bad abstraction, I was like, oh yeah, no, okay, that makes sense. Been there.
Yeah, seconded.
I was like, all right, you won me over.
Having a white beard sometimes helps.
I've watched one of your talks where you prefaced it with keep an open mind. And I won't lie, you really have to do that to sort of digest it in a valuable way, as opposed to just, no, that goes against everything I've ever been told, will not listen. Because yes, it is a very different paradigm than I think most of us are used to working in, where, yeah, you share everything, reusability, component libraries, but you made some extremely valid arguments for why that's not always the best thing to do.
No, absolutely. I mean, sometimes you find that duplicating some code is less horrible than you think, because then you have an agility that you don't have. Obviously, when you need to bring a change to, 4 or 5 parts of the code and they are similar, it's a pain. But just to give you an example, when we decide to have duplication for the header and footer instead of creating a component, the reason behind that were several reasons. The first one was, how often do we change the header and the footer? And I went back on Git and I checked. We changed twice in 3 years. So if we change another time, yeah, probably it's a pain, but how long is taking for a developer to changing, adding a new item inside the footer and the header? Probably 30 seconds. Multiply by 4, yeah, probably is still acceptable. The other thing was, each single footer and header have different behavior in different parts of the application. So then we need a team that has to know how to map this. And then when we develop, it's not a component that has to be, let's say, iterated too often. When you develop once, it's there for 6 months, 8 months, or a year, wherever it is. So does it make sense that we create a team that owns that, and in 6 months' time, we create, let's say, they has to rethink completely on the code that they have written 6 months before for adding what? Just an item. Didn't make sense at that time. Currently, we are looking to, let's say, reviewing those decisions. But I think so far, those decisions were, despite against some rules, quite good for us, because at the end, we discovered that the product team had some ideas on how to improve certain areas of the application. And that was impacting exactly this. And without any external dependency, the team was able to deliver in a matter of days instead of weeks, because otherwise you have an external dependency for a distributed team that has to be aware of this. It has to prioritize inside this backlog. And it will take longer, the communication part, than doing a change inside a duplication piece of code.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to echo Ari's point, I think when I was first, sort of reading the article, and obviously a lot of micro-frontend goes against what we're traditionally used to. And so I think what you do a great job with is reminding us that, as developers, it's not just about following rules blindly, but really keeping things into context. And for those, we're going to include his Medium article in the links. But just the way you sort of take tweets that where people took things out of context and misinterpreted them, and then like putting them into context and learning how to accept trade-offs as developers, I think that's really critical for us to be thinking intelligently rather than just be like, well, they always said, don't repeat your code. So I'm just going to do that, even though, to your point, right? 4 developers, make 4 changes, twice in 3 years. Like that's not very expensive from a cost perspective. So, yeah.
Yeah, fully. I mean, too often, unfortunately, I saw that abstraction led to more troubles than benefits. I'm not saying that our approach is perfect, far to be, but I'm saying it's a different approach. We are experimenting at scale, and we saw that there are some good things coming out from it. And I like to share. I like to be challenged. If there are people that are saying, no, this is completely wrong for a certain reason, happy to have a discussion with them. Recently, for instance, a few months ago, there was a huge flame on Twitter, considering you mentioned that, on Micro-Frontends.
Isn't there a flame on Twitter like every other day?
Yeah. But that was specific to Micro-Frontends. Where quite few people...
At the time. It's from Dan Abramov. He said, I don't understand micro-frontends.
No, it was absolutely valuable. I mean, as you said, you need to understand the context. And personally, when I read that, there was few people that mentioned me on that tweet and they said, oh, wow. Now I feel that I need to do something. But obviously, English is not my native language. Therefore, trying to explain something that complex in 140 characters or 200 characters, whatever they are, right now, I thought, no, that is not going to work with me. So I thought to write an article that is available on Medium as well. And that was a huge success. I had a lot of people at the conferences after that article, let's say in community that were saying that were quite impressed about the, let's say, the things that I shared, and that I think I didn't offend anyone, I hope at least. I think it was just sharing my thought, technical thought, and trying to do my best to clear some hair, because I sometimes, on the community, in particular on Twitter, could become quite rough because people have strong opinions. But in reality, I think also behind strong opinions, you can find something truth, and you need to embrace that. And if you remove, let's say, the bad part, and you think what this person is trying to communicate, maybe you can find some inspiration on how to explain better a concept that in your mind was crystal and clear, but in other people's mind, it wasn't. And that, for me, is a key takeaway when I read that flame on Micro-Frontends.
I have to say, I found the style of that article really cool, but very interesting, because I don't know if this was intentional or not, but you had this tendency to sort of rip off the Band-Aid with concepts and then temper it. Like, I would read a sentence, I'm like, what? No. How dare he? And then you're like, but I don't actually believe that, just saying. But I thought that was good, because like immediately you got like my brain like, what? Just turning and like how could like it? So it ignited passion, which I don't know, for me, I remember concepts better if there's some passion involved in the process of learning it. So I really appreciated that, whether it was intentional or not.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. No, I'm a really passionate person, probably because I'm Italian, or basically because I love what I'm doing and I don't think it's a job. But in reality, I think if you don't have passion for this job, that is asking a lot, because you need to keep up to date, reading books and going to communities, learn from others, trying to reinvent yourself. I cannot say every year, but often, let's say that way. You don't really, you cannot really work in this industry. I mean, this industry is fantastic because you cannot get bored if you really like what you're doing.
I agree with that. I 100% agree with that. All right. And where can people find you, Luca?
Currently, I'm on all the socials, LinkedIn and Twitter, GitHub, Medium. You think about the social, probably I'm there, apart from Instagram, but the rest is fine. So you can find me on GitHub with my first name, last name, but everywhere, honestly, on the social with my first name and last name. I have on Medium my where I'm collecting all the articles around Micro-Frontends and other topics that I discuss, also like AWS, Lambda, the serverless paradigm. I'm pretty like that paradigm. And those are mainly where you can find me.
All right.
Back when functional programming was making its resurgence, I found it really interesting that a lot of people were moving over there, and it almost felt like it was on hype, and I didn't really understand the power of functional programming until I learned Elixir. Elixir is a functional programming language. It's built on the Erlang virtual machine, and it really does some interesting things and makes you build apps in a different way. But what's really fascinating about it is the speed of the applications, the ability to distribute work easily, and just how it manages the functional programming and all of the nice things about it so that you don't have to worry about side effects and a lot of the other things that come out of functional programming. Plus, pattern matching in Elixir is a killer feature. If you're looking for a new language that you want to learn that is going to make a difference for you and give you the opportunity to challenge some of your thinking and find a new way of doing it, Elixir is a great way to go. And we have a podcast now on Elixir called Elixir Mix, and you can find that at elixirmix.com.
Now let's move on to picks. Ben, would you like to start us off?
Sure. So I think Chris gave this pick actually a couple of weeks ago. I've been reading Exhalations. I think it's by Ted Chiang. And so that has been just a fantastic journey of just explorations into like futuristic worlds, and like the writing of it is just phenomenal. So again, I can second Chris's pick from a couple of weeks ago. So it's Exhalations.
And that's a book of short stories by Ted Chiang, right?
Yes, that is correct. My second pick for this week is the Perplexus Epic. For those who've never, so you know those like little mazes with like the metal ball that you like used to play with as a kid? Like
Yeah,
think
okay.
of that as a gigantic ball, but there's like, it's like a 3D maze. You have to like turn and like control the physics, and there's like ramps where it switches and drops. And so my buddies at Politico have one at the office, and it's like a competition to see who can get the farthest. So that's like a big thing right now. Great like office time waster as people compete over it. So I'll be sure to drop that in the links. But those are my picks for this week.
I had one of those. I don't know if mine was just cheap, but like literally you could not get past like the first 2 inches because there was like a tolerancing issue. But yeah, so I ended up giving it to my nephews who really didn't care. They just liked that it rattled.
I heard that some have lower build quality. So I'll drop the Perplexus Epic, which is the hardest one. So I know there'll be developers out there who are like, I can challenge accepted.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I should have sprung for a slightly more high quality one. All right, Elizabeth, would you like to go?
Yeah, okay. I have one as usual, and that is this app I found for managing my recipes because I love cooking and I've never been able to find a good way to like keep all my recipes in one place with pictures that are right there, and especially one where it's like a requirement that I can be able to import from a URL. And so I found this app called Cookbook. So pretty self-explanatory name there. And it's really nice. It's been really easy to use. You can like tag recipes with different things. You can edit the steps. You can connect a video. So I've been using that recently and I've been really liking it. And that is my pick for today.
I'll have to check that out. Not for myself, but for my husband because I don't cook. Luca, would you like to go?
Yeah, I have 2 picks. The first one is the last book that I read. I know that it's not the newest one, but it's pretty cool, and it's called The Phoenix Project. It's a book, basically an IT novel, and it's explaining how a company with a lot of legacy stuff are moving to the cloud. It's absolutely stunning. It's like 350 pages of pure IT concepts and how they are moving from iteration of months to iteration of days, if not multiple times per day. And it's absolutely amazing. And I know that in November, there is from the same author, the new book that is called The Unicorn Project. It is after 5 years, I think, they are moving to this thing because obviously at the end of the Phoenix Project, there are some twists that are leading towards the Unicorn Project. Pretty interesting. And the second thing, if you're interested to know more on the technical part of micro-frontends, I have a webinar on O'Reilly web platform that will take place the 30th of September. It will be 3 hours and a half webinar on micro-frontends where I'm going through more in detail on what are the different architectures that you can apply on micro-frontends, what are the principles behind them, and how you can start your journey with micro-frontends.
Thank you. All right, Chris, you're up.
All right. First, apologies for being a little bit quiet today. I'm moving to Durham, North Carolina in a week, or at least at the time of recording. By the time you hear this, I will be there. Or actually, I will probably not be there because I'll be traveling because September and October are crazy. But anyway, yeah, I've been doing a little bit of multitasking. I apologize for that. My first pick is Voice Attack. When I haven't been working on moving stuff, I've been playing a game called Elite Dangerous sometimes, which I've talked about on this podcast. And Voice Attack is a program that allows you to create macros out of voice commands. So for example, I can say attack pattern alpha and, deploy fighters and have them attack in a certain way. And then I can also say things like engage, which to go into to
sounds amazing.
To jump to another star. Which for anyone who's a Trek fan, especially a Next Generation fan specifically, this is kind of the dream. I played this in VR, so this it adds to the immersion so much to be able to just give commands. And they have a bunch of different voice packs. I haven't bought any of them yet. I'm sure I will. With William Shatner, Brent Spiner, both from Star Trek, and some other people too, that can be the voice of your computer. And it's so fun. I'm currently in the trial. I will have to buy it. I think it's only $12, so it's not too bad. And you can use it with any game, not just Elite Dangerous.
My Twitch stream would have been so much more interesting with that. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's cool. I'll have to try that with some other games. My next pick is, again, at the time of recording, Taylor Swift's new album, Lover.
I was going to say that, but then I was like, no.
I don't know how I feel about you anymore.
I don't think there's any
I was afraid if people would judge me.
I used to think oh yeah, Taylor Swift, isn't that for teenagers? Don't teenagers listen to that? But I've been a fan since her Red album, and then on to 1989 and Reputation and Lover still. Although Lover is different in many ways, but still very interesting. And as a sort of side pick, last night, Katie and I, after I'd listened through it a couple times, just while I was working, my wife Katie and I just sat down and listened through the whole thing and just talked about the songs. And it's so fun, listening to an album with someone. I think that's something that people don't do as much anymore. I used to do it more when I was younger because there wasn't that much to do. But it's still it's so fun, and sharing that musical experience with someone is so special and can really help bring you closer together. So with a friend or some other loved one, I definitely recommend this activity if you'd like to, find a cool way to bond.
Favorite song, Chris?
Ooh, gosh. I mean, right now, Cruel Summer, maybe.
Okay.
Cruel Summer is the one that's most stuck in my head.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a lot that I like. And there are some that I
stuck on my head.
And a lot of the big ones that you hear, if you're thinking oh yeah, I've heard some stuff from Taylor Swift's new album and I hated it. If you heard Me, she wrote that as a joke. That's a joke song. That's a joke song about the stuff that people expect her to put out. That's not meant to be a real song to be enjoyed.
Interesting.
So if you do not like Me, that is definitely okay. You are not meant to.
Hey. It's going to be a while before I get over that one, Chris. Okay. Sorry, no judgment.
Did you really like Me?
No. I'm still in shock that was your pick.
Oh, okay. I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I just want to be clear for anybody who's listening. If you do like Me, the song, I'm not saying there's something wrong with you. And I think you can enjoy songs that are not that good still. That's fine. I enjoy some songs that are not that good too. But it is a bad song. And some of the rhymes, it's just how did she has to know what she's doing here. Did she rhyme with me and you with you? This is absurd.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. Well, I guess finally it's time for my picks. So my pick this week is technically a 2-for-1. It's What We Do in the Shadows, which was both a movie and now a TV series. So the movie you can find on Netflix, and the TV series is on Hulu. Now we'll get to the premise. It's basically a mockumentary about vampires, and it is so funny. And in the TV series, there is a scene which has cameos from many actors who famously played vampires. That is so worth all of it. So I highly recommend What We Do in the Shadows. And that's it for this episode of Views on Vue. Thank you for joining us. And until next week, enjoy the view.
This segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com to learn more.